The British establishment just shattered. In a move that sent shockwaves through Westminster and left political analysts scrambling for explanations, King Charles has made a decision that's rewriting the rules of British democracy. Sources close to Buckingham Palace confirmed that in an unprecedented constitutional manoeuvre, the King has bypassed traditional channels and granted significant authority directly to Nigel Farage, the man the establishment spent decades trying to silence. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's reaction absolutely volcanic. Behind closed doors, witnesses describe a scene of pure fury, with the Labour leader reportedly unleashing a tirade that left senior officials stunned. This isn't just political theatre. This is a constitutional earthquake that could reshape Britain forever. What power has the King actually transferred? Why Nigel Farage? And why now? And most critically, what does this mean for Keir Starmer's grip on number 10? The answers are more explosive than anyone could have imagined, and what's unfolding right now could mark the beginning of the most dramatic political transformation in modern British history. Let's be absolutely clear about what's happening here, because the mainstream media is already working overtime to downplay the magnitude of this moment. For years, decades even, Nigel Farage has been the ultimate outsider, the political insurgent who represented everything the establishment feared. They mocked him, they marginalised him, they tried every trick in the book to keep him out of power. Brexit should have been his vindication, his moment of triumph, but instead the political elite simply absorbed the result and continued as if nothing fundamental had changed. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully contained the populist threat and could return to business as usual. They were catastrophically wrong. What's emerged in the last few hours isn't just another political controversy or another Westminster scandal that will blow over by next week. This represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in Britain, and the tremors are being felt from Downing Street to Brussels. According to multiple sources within royal circles, King Charles has been increasingly frustrated with the direction of British politics under Keir Starmer's Labour government. The King, despite constitutional conventions that supposedly keep the monarchy above politics, has never been shy about his opinions on matters of national importance. His decades of advocacy on environmental issues, urban planning and traditional values have always suggested a monarch who wouldn't simply rubber stamp whatever Parliament decided. But this goes far beyond expressing opinions or gentle suggestions. What we're witnessing is direct intervention, a flexing of constitutional muscle that many thought had atrophied beyond use. The power that King Charles has reportedly granted to Nigel Farage centres around a rarely used constitutional provision that allows the monarch to appoint special advisers with extraordinary authority during times of national crisis. Now, you might be asking, what national crisis? That's precisely the point. The definition of crisis is subjective, and if the King believes that Britain's current trajectory constitutes a crisis of governance, of identity, of sovereignty, then he has the theoretical power to act, and act he has. Nigel Farage, according to its palace insiders, has been granted a position that essentially allows him to review, challenge and potentially veto certain government policies, particularly those relating to Britain's relationship with international bodies, immigration policy and constitutional matters. Think about the implications for a moment. The man who championed Brexit, who built his entire political career on challenging the establishment consensus, now has the constitutional authority to directly confront a Labour government that many of his supporters believe is betraying the Brexit mandate. Keir Starmer's government has been quietly moving toward closer alignment with European regulatory frameworks, softening immigration enforcement and prioritising international agreements over domestic priorities. For Farage's supporters, this looks like the establishment doing exactly what they always do, pretending to respect the people's will while undermining it through bureaucratic manoeuvring. The King's decision to elevate Farage changes everything. Suddenly, there's a countervailing force with real power, not just media presence or parliamentary speeches that get ignored, but actual constitutional authority. The reaction from Number 10 has been nothing short of apocalyptic. Multiple sources describe Keir Starmer's initial response as one of complete disbelief, followed rapidly by incandescent rage. The Prime Minister, who has carefully cultivated an image of calm managerial competence, reportedly erupted during an emergency cabinet meeting, demanding to know how this could have happened without warning, without consultation, without any of the usual channels providing advance notice. His fury isn't difficult to understand. Starmer won his election with a substantial majority. He has the parliamentary numbers to push through his agenda, and he believed he had the political capital to reshape Britain according to Labour's vision. The idea that the monarchy could simply insert a figure like Nigel Farage into the power structure, giving him authority that circumvents the elected government, represents a direct challenge to everything Starmer thought he understood about how British politics works. Senior Labour MPs are describing the mood in government as somewhere between panic and defiance. Some are calling for immediate legal challenges to the King's decision, arguing that this represents an unconstitutional overreach that threatens parliamentary sovereignty. Others, perhaps more pragmatic, are trying to figure out how to work with this new reality, how to neutralise Farage's influence or co-opt him into the existing power structure. But here's what makes this situation so explosive. Nigel Farage isn't someone who can be easily managed or bought off. His entire political identity is built on being the outsider, the disruptor, the voice of ordinary people against the machinations of the elite. Giving him actual power doesn't domesticate him, it potentially weaponises him in ways the establishment never anticipated. The constitutional scholars are already weighing in, and their analyses reveal just how unprecedented this situation truly is. While the British Constitution isn't codified in a single document like American or French constitutions, it operates through a complex web of conventions, statutes, and precedents built up over centuries. The monarch's role has been increasingly ceremonial since the development of parliamentary democracy, with the understanding that the Crown acts on the advice of ministers and doesn't exercise independent political judgment. That convention, it now appears, was never actually law, just habit. The legal reality is that the Crown retains enormous theoretical powers that have simply gone unused for so long that everyone assumed they'd been permanently surrendered. The power to appoint advisors, to request briefings, to demand consultations. These were never formally abolished, just quietly forgotten. King Charles, whether through careful legal research or bold political instinct, has reached back into Britain's constitutional past and pulled forward a power that most thought was purely historical curiosity. And he's handed it to the one person guaranteed to use it most aggressively. The political implications of what's unfolding extend far beyond the immediate power struggle between Starmer and Farage. This represents a fundamental question about the nature of British democracy itself, about where ultimate authority resides and who gets to make decisions that shape the nation's future. For generations, the answer seemed obvious. Parliament is sovereign. The elected government governs, and the monarchy provides symbolic continuity without interfering in actual policy. That comfortable assumption has just been obliterated. What makes this moment particularly dangerous for Keir Starmer is the timing. His government is barely into its term, still trying to establish its authority and implement its agenda. Labour's massive parliamentary majority should have guaranteed years of stable governance, the ability to push through reforms without serious opposition. But numbers in Parliament mean nothing if constitutional authority can simply bypass the entire legislative process. Farage, operating with royal backing, doesn't need to win votes or build coalitions. He has direct access to power through an entirely different channel, one that the traditional political class has no experience defending against. The constitutional crisis this creates is staggering in its complexity. If the Prime Minister challenges the King's decision through legal channels, he risks appearing to attack the monarchy itself, something that remains deeply unpopular with large segments of the British public. If he accepts the situation and tries to work around Farage's new authority, he looks weak and admits that his government doesn't actually control the levers of power. Either path leads to a catastrophic erosion of his political standing. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations are reportedly underway. Senior civil servants, the permanent apparatus of the British state, are trying desperately to find some middle ground, some compromise that allows both the government and the king to step back from the brink without either side losing too much face. But compromise requires both parties to want a peaceful resolution, and there's little evidence that either King Charles or Nigel Farage has any interest in backing down. The king, sources suggest, believes he's acting in the national interest, using his constitutional authority to correct what he sees as a dangerous drift in British governance. Farage, for his part, has spent his entire career waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, a chance to exercise real power rather than just influence from the margins. The reaction from the British public is splitting along predictable lines, but with some surprising cross-currents. Traditional Conservative voters are torn between their instinctive loyalty to constitutional order and their frustration with how Brexit has been implemented. Many see Farage's elevation as a necessary corrective, a way to ensure that the will of the people, as expressed in the referendum, actually gets implemented rather than slowly undermined. Labour voters are predictably outraged, viewing this as an undemocratic coup that overturns an election result through royal fiat. But there's a significant portion of the electorate that doesn't fit neatly into either camp, people who voted for Brexit but then voted Labour, or who support some of Starmer's domestic policies but share Farage's scepticism about international entanglements. These voters are the real battleground, and how they interpret this constitutional showdown could determine Britain's political direction for decades. International reaction has been swift and almost universally negative. European Union officials, never fans of either Brexit or Farage, are watching with barely concealed satisfaction as Britain's political system appears to eat itself. The spectacle of constitutional chaos provides perfect ammunition for those who always argued that Brexit was built on fantasy and delusion. American officials are more diplomatically careful but clearly concerned. Britain has been a crucial ally, particularly in matters of intelligence sharing and military cooperation, and political instability in London creates complications for Washington. There are already whispers about whether agreements negotiated with Starmer's government will actually hold if power dynamics shift so dramatically. Financial markets, always sensitive to political uncertainty, have responded with predictable nervousness. Sterling has weakened against major currencies, and there's been significant volatility in British government bonds. The economic costs of constitutional crisis are already mounting, and they'll only increase the longer this standoff continues. Business leaders, regardless of their political preferences, desperately want stability and predictability. What they're getting instead is a situation where nobody can confidently predict who will be making key decisions next week, let alone next month. The media landscape has fractured along tribal lines with an intensity that makes previous political divisions look tame by comparison. Right-leaning outlets are celebrating what they characterise as a necessary constitutional correction, a reassertion of British sovereignty against a political class that never truly accepted the Brexit verdict. Left-leaning publications are apocalyptic in their warnings, comparing the King's actions to historical moments when monarchs overreached and provoked constitutional crises. The truth, as always, is more complex than either narrative allows. What's particularly fascinating is how this crisis exposes the fundamental ambiguity at the heart of the British Constitution. Unlike systems with clear written rules and defined powers, Britain has always operated on the basis of conventions and understandings that work precisely because everyone agrees in not to push them too hard. The moment someone decides to test the actual limits of their constitutional authority, the whole elegant system reveals itself to be built on remarkably shaky foundations. King Charles has essentially called everyone's bluff, demonstrating that powers everyone thought were purely theoretical can actually be exercised if a monarch is willing to face the political consequences. The question now becomes whether those consequences will be severe enough to force a retreat, or whether this represents a permanent shift in how Britain is governed. For Nigel Farage, this is the culmination of a political journey that seemed destined to end in frustration and marginalisation. He delivered Brexit, but was shut out of the actual negotiations and implementation. He built UKIP into a force that reshaped British politics, but never managed to translate that into parliamentary seats under the first past-the-post electoral system. He founded the Brexit Party and then Reform UK, winning votes, but struggling to break through into actual governmental power. Now, suddenly, he has access to authority that transcends the normal political process entirely. The irony is almost too perfect. The establishment spent years ensuring that Farage couldn't win through normal democratic channels, and in doing so, they may have created the conditions where he could bypass those channels altogether. The mechanisms through which Farage can now exercise his newfound authority are still being clarified, but early indications suggest they're far more substantial than anyone initially understood. The position granted to him by King Charles reportedly includes the right to receive all cabinet papers and ministerial briefings, access to classified intelligence assessments, and most critically, the ability to formally register objections to government policies that could then require additional parliamentary scrutiny or even royal assent procedures. This isn't simply an advisory role where Farage can offer opinions that get politely ignored. This is structural power embedded directly into the machinery of government. Every major policy decision that Starmer's government wants to implement now potentially faces a checkpoint where Farage can intervene, demand justification, or trigger additional procedural requirements that could delay or derail implementation entirely. The practical implications are staggering. Consider immigration policy, an area where Farage has built his reputation and where Labour's approach differs fundamentally from what Brexit supporters expected. If Starmer's government attempts to relax visa requirements, increase refugee intake, or negotiate agreements that effectively restore freedom of movement with European countries, Farage now has the constitutional standing to challenge these moves directly. He can demand that such policies be put to additional parliamentary votes, require ministerial explanations under oath, or even suggest that certain agreements violate the spirit of the Brexit referendum and therefore require special consideration. The same applies to regulatory alignment with the European Union, environmental policies that Farage's supporters view as economically damaging, or any international commitments that could be characterised as surrendering British sovereignty. On trade negotiations, Farage's influence could be particularly disruptive. The Starmer government has been working toward closer economic cooperation with the EU, trying to smooth over some of the friction that Brexit created without formally rejoining any EU structures. These negotiations are delicate, requiring careful diplomatic positioning, and the ability to make commitments that trading partners can trust will be honoured. Farage's presence as a constitutional overseer introduces massive uncertainty into this process. How can EU negotiators trust any agreement when they know that Farage has the power to potentially unravel it through constitutional challenges? How can Starmer's ministers negotiate effectively when every concession might be publicly attacked and formally challenged by someone with actual governmental authority? The answer is that they probably can't, which means Britain's international economic relationships face a period of paralysis precisely when clarity and stability are most needed. Within Whitehall, the permanent civil service that actually runs the day-to-day operations of government, there's reportedly complete confusion about how to navigate this new reality. Civil servants are trained to serve the elected government of the day, implementing ministerial decisions within the bounds of law and proper procedure. They understand how to manage relationships between different government departments, how to handle parliamentary oversight, and how to work within established constitutional frameworks. Nobody has any experience managing a situation where a figure outside the normal governmental hierarchy has been granted sweeping oversight powers by the monarch. The usual chains of command and accountability have been disrupted in ways that make basic governmental functions difficult to execute. There are reports of ministerial meetings being delayed or cancelled because nobody can agree on whether Farage or his representatives need to be present or briefed. Policy papers are reportedly being rewritten multiple times as officials try to anticipate what objections Farage might raise and how to preemptively address them. The entire machinery of government is slowing down. becoming more cautious and risk-averse, precisely the opposite of what any new government wants when trying to establish momentum and demonstrate competence. The historical parallels being drawn are ominous. Constitutional scholars point to various moments in British history when conflicts between Crown and Parliament produced genuine crises, from the English Civil War in the 17th century to the constitutional battles of the early 20th century over the power of the House of Lords. In each case, the eventual resolution required either compromise, legal reform, or in the most extreme cases, violence and revolution. Nobody seriously believes Britain is heading towards civil war, but the comparison illustrates how destabilising these fundamental questions about authority and legitimacy can become. The problem with constitutional crises is that they can't be resolved through normal political processes because those processes themselves are what's being contested. Keir Starmer's attempts to contain the damage have so far been remarkably unsuccessful. His public statements have tried to strike a balance between respecting the monarchy and defending parliamentary democracy, but this middle ground satisfies nobody. To his own supporters, he appears weak and insufficiently willing to fight back against what they see as an assault on democratic governance. To Farage's supporters, any criticism of the King's decision looks like establishment arrogance and contempt for constitutional tradition. Starmer's political instincts, honed through years as a lawyer and then as a careful opposition leader, are fundamentally unsuited to this kind of existential fight. He's a man who believes in rules, procedures, and working within established systems. What happens when the system itself becomes the battleground? His response has been to call for dialogue, consultation, and finding common ground, all entirely reasonable positions that sound utterly inadequate when faced with a genuine constitutional rupture. His cabinet is reportedly divided on how to proceed, with some ministers advocating for immediate legal challenges to test the limits of the King's authority in courts, while others counsel patience and strategic accommodation. The divisions reflect deeper questions about Labour's identity and purpose. Is the party fundamentally committed to radical change that might require confronting established institutions, or is it ultimately a party of gradual reform working within existing structures? The current crisis forces that question into sharp relief, and the answer isn't clear. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage is doing what he does best, dominating the media narrative and positioning himself as the voice of ordinary people against an arrogant establishment. His public statements since receiving his new authority have been characteristically provocative, suggesting that he intends to use his powers aggressively to ensure that the Brexit mandate is properly implemented and that government policies reflect what he characterises as the true will of the British people. He's framing this not as a constitutional crisis, but as a constitutional correction, arguing that the real crisis was the disconnect between what voters demanded and what the political class delivered. It's an effective message, particularly for the millions of Britons who feel that their vote for Brexit has been systematically undermined.